All right, let's get into Amy Lowell's The Sisters. And uh, first things first, I wanted to highlight something in this edition. Sappho is spelt correctly, but in Amy Lowell's original, she actually spelt Sappho's name with one P. It was her own particular spelling. And so I just want to let you know in other versions that will be taking place. So this is a poem that is at once sort of acknowledging and celebrating sisterhood, and also celebrating and honoring female literary traditions and female poetic voices. And in fact, it's one of the first poems sort of its type to really try to create a female literary tradition and to highlight it and to show that there is a female literary tradition. So there's something quite beautiful in it. But there's also some complexities within it, because as much as it is highlighting and celebrating three major poets in Sappho, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and Emily Dickinson, and even Amy Lowell herself, there are also some criticisms and some separation and some pondering and sort of doubting about the different poets and who they were and how they wrote and how they approached writing, and also the varying levels of ability and inability to escape the male dominant literary tradition and male dominated literary realm that women were always butting up against or being judged against, and also being criticized against, because often, especially as comes out through this poem, with Elizabeth Barrett Browning and other, if you even want to jump to Sylvia Plath and other female writers who are married to very renowned and popular male writers, there's always a question of how much of their writing is theirs, how much of their writing isn't theirs, how much are they influenced, how much is it of their true experience. So the women can't always get away from that. There's a sort of underlying question as about why women would want to write, why women would want to be poets to this. And there's also a seeking of how do women write, and how do women poets engage in their craft. It's honoring the poets before, it's invoking this female history that's modeled on sisterhood. And I think this is important for us to think about, because that means also the speaker in the poem is a descendant of those sisters, right? And so this sisterhood of poetesses, of writers, it's also removing the sort of patriarchal idea of female competition and the Freudian concept, this Freudian romance of female murderous competition. And so it's more about the solidarity. But even though it is about solidarity, by the end of the poem, there's an acknowledgement of solidarity, but also it's complicated. Let's go ahead and look at it real quickly. It's complicated here with the need to express oneself and to feel solidarity with past writers, but then also the need to separate oneself and to move forward with female literary tradition. And I think we see this push and pull, this tug and pull throughout the entire poem between honoring, excuse me, criticizing, and wanting to find one's own space within the female literary tradition. I'm going to move back to the beginning of the poem. I want to give a little bit of a sort of etymology for the word queer, taking us by and large, we're a queer lot, we women who write poetry. So in early 16th century, the word queer meant strange, odd, peculiar, or eccentric. And that definition permeated even to the time when Amy Lowell's writing this poem. And that, I believe, is the definition that she's using. But there's also been a complicated relationship with the word queer, because it was also used colloquially, pejoratively, and derogatorily, that was often offensive and harmful, and became sort of a slur, particularly to speak to, refer to gay men, but then also gay people in general. And this is happening more in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. It starts to change in the 60s and 70s, where the word queer was more reclaimed, and especially by the LGBTQ plus community. And it was reclaimed and used as a term of empowerment. But then in the 90s, it takes on even a more political sort of meaning, and it refers to identity that challenges normative ideas about sexuality and gender. So I think you could, especially taking a queer theory lens, especially with some of the poets that Lowell's speaking about, and certainly her own identity and sexuality, I think you could broaden this topic to a queer idea, to maybe include other elements of the LGBTQ plus perspective and community. But for here, I think it's more, in this instance, in this sentence, about peculiar. I think it's interesting to see the speaker talking about we women who write poetry as being a queer lot. And when you think how few of us there have been, it's queerer still. I wonder what it is that makes us do it, singles us out to scribble down, manwise, the fragments of ourselves. Why are we already mother creatures, double bearing, with matrices in body and in brain? I rather think that there is just the reason we are so sparse a kind of human being. The strength of 40,000 atlases is needed for everyday concerns. So notice at once, what's she doing here? It takes a rare person to be a poet, but even more so a woman, with all of the different responsibilities and roles thrust upon the woman by society, right? And it's interesting that she's pulling from mythology with Atlas, and how many Atlases and their strengths would it take to just equate to a woman writer, right? I think she's elevating female roles and responsibilities here. And I think that at the same time, she's highlighting how few famous poets there are, at least in America, that she's talking about now. And also, man-wise, it's been a man's literary world, right? It's been a man's world. And the females who, it does take strength and courage for females to travel outside of the personal home sphere and realm where women are societally relegated to, and to branch out into this very vulnerable, exposed public realm. I also want to think about why she might choose Sappho, and who Sappho is. And I think who spoke, and that we too were sisters of a strange, isolated little family. And it's this, the setting of this poem is so lovely because Amy Lowell in her life hosted lots of gatherings and parties of all sorts of different people. And so for her to imagine sitting down and having an afternoon with these poets and being able to converse with them is incredibly imaginative, and it draws us in. But it also makes it very personal and conversational and very accessible and relatable, right? And when we're looking at exploring this queer lot and looking at Sappho, who's from Lesbos and is certainly a queer woman in ancient Greece, and a lesbian coming from the island of Lesbos where she lived, I think there's some interesting reasons and purposes that Amy Lowell would be starting with Sappho because she is the first, but then also with her being a part of the same community, the LGBTQ plus community. I think that there's something special happening with this as well. I think that there's something here, and she is Sappho, Sappho, not Miss or Mrs. A leaping fire we call so for convenience. I think this is really important. Notice how just by this one line, Lowell, or the speaker, has been able to separate Sappho's identity as a writer, as a person, as a woman, separate from her identity in relation to a man. Notice that by being called Miss or Mrs., a woman is being differentiated by her relationship to a man. Either she's single and unmarried, or she's married. Whereas men only have Mr. It doesn't delineate their relationship to being single or married. That's why we had the movement pretty much in the 60s, 70s, with the Ms. movement, right? To separate from identifying oneself in relation to a man for women. But notice, but Mrs. Browning, who would ever think of such presumption as to call her Ba? That was her nickname, Ba, and it was a familiar thing. And it's interesting that Lowell is sort of calling this comparison between these two authors. I think it's also interesting that she says Mrs. Browning's heart was squeezed in stiff conventions. This is interesting. Is she saying that Elizabeth Browning wasn't able to express the fullness of her poetic heart, that she was relegated to these conventions? So she lay stretched out upon a sofa reading Greek and speculating, as I must suppose, in just this way on Sappho, all the need, the huge imperious need of loving, crushed within the body she believed so sick. Elizabeth Barrett Browning did have some physical ailments, but what's also interesting is as much as she was married, she, to a man, she and her husband had a lot of female friends who were in female lesbian, queer, loving relationships. And there are some literary critics who are questioning whether or not Elizabeth Barrett Browning herself might have been bisexual, but it's that concrete evidence is hard to come by. But I think that even Amy Lowell might be questioning this a little bit, and seeing that in close relationships that Elizabeth Barrett Browning had with other lesbian couples, that at the very least she's an ally, but she might also be part of the community. She speaks a lot about convention, and I think we get a little bit more criticism about Elizabeth Barrett Browning when we get here. Suppose there hadn't been a Robert Browning, no sonnets from the Portuguese would have been written. They are the first of all her poems to be, one might say, fertilized. For after all, a poet is flesh and blood as well as brain, and Mrs. Browning, as I said before, was very, very woman. Well, there are two of us, and vastly unlike, that's for certain. Unlike, at least, until we tear the veils away which commonly gird souls. I scarcely think Mrs. Browning would have approved the process in spite of what had surely been relief, for speaking souls must always want to speak, even when bat-eyed, narrow-minded queens set prudishness to keep the keys of impulse. This is referring to Confound Victoria. That's Queen Victoria and the strict social conventions and rules of the time that would have dominated female life, in addition to female writing, which I think is a way that Lowell as writer and the speaker of the poem are trying to make sense of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sort of writing. And I think there's also an interesting thing that is being done here with the linking to Robert Browning, that a lot of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poems are love poems about her husband, but I think at the core the question that Lowell as a writer is asking is what other poems could Elizabeth Barrett Browning have written had she not have had that close relationship or that sort of overarching presence of Robert Browning, and also the constrictions and conventions of literature at the time, particularly on women, under Queen Victoria's rule. And then we move into Emily Dickinson. But I go dreaming on in love with these my spiritual relations. I rather think I see myself wake up a flight of wooden steps and ring a bell and send a card in to Miss Dickinson. Yet that's a very silly way to do. So even in this dreaming, they're almost spiritual sisters, right? And certainly Emily Dickinson was a known bisexual woman, and so I should have taken the dream twist's ends about and climbed over the fence and found her deep engrossed in the doings of Hummingbird among nasturtiums. Not having expected strangers, she might forget to think me one, and holding up a finger say quite casually, "Take care, don't frighten him, he's only just begun." So a beautiful little look into an imaginative experience and conversation with Dickinson. And we've also got sorry, I got lost in my notes there. So Now we have Strange Trio of My Sister. This harkens back to the opening of the queer as peculiar, right? Most diverse, and how extraordinarily unlike each is to me, and which way shall I go? So here's that solidarity, connectivity, but also separation. Amy Lowell is trying to see herself as an author and a writer and a poet, to see where does she fit in this female literary tradition. And then she kind of summarizes it and goes through and articulates more about the patriarchy, the monarchy, about religion, and the influences on writers, particularly female writers, to get to the end here as she's saying goodbye, or good night, not goodbye. She's going to continue her dream on her own, right? And move forward in her own writing. There's lots more we could have gone over, but as you can see, it's already been quite a bit of time just highlighting those few things. So I can't wait to see what other things you identify and where you go with this poem.